Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining Pride Partners International in this webinar where we'll talk about the comparable and controlled price method applied to commodity transactions in developing countries. And we're going to focus on Latin American countries. As you know, their economies rely heavily on exporting commodities. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Damian Larco, and I'm the senior partner and founder of TPAdvice, a boutique transfer pricing and valuation firm with operations in Ecuador, Bolivia, Paraguay, and most recently in Panama. Besides, with our PPI association, we are able to provide transfer pricing and valuation services worldwide. As an specialist, I have a broad range of experience in transfer pricing compliance, planning, and designing defense strategies. I'm a professor in a postgraduate transfer pricing diploma in Paraguay, and I've been a speaker in several seminars. The most recent one is the PPI Transfer Pricing Convention in Paris. Okay, let's have a look at the agenda. First, we're going to describe what is the issue, what is the problem with commodity transactions. Then we're going to talk about the domestic rules implemented by tax administrations, also called the sixth method. Then we're going to check on the OECD recommendations in the BEPS project. And finally, I'm going to give you my conclusions and recommendations. Okay, so what is the issue? What is the problem here? As I said in the intro, we're going to focus on Latin American countries. And if you look at LATAM top export products, you'll find out their economies, as I said before, rely heavily on exporting commodities. For instance, soybean in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, oil and gas in Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia, agricultural products in Honduras, Guatemala, Costa Rica, minerals in Peru, and Chile. By the way, our source here is the Economic Commission for Latin American and the Caribbean, which is one of the 5 regional commissions of the United Nations. But you might wonder, what are the implications of having an economy dependent on the exports of primary goods, of commodities? Well, this means that fiscal revenue, the government revenue, is susceptible to commodity price shocks. This is why when oil prices drop down, oil-producing countries face a recession. And this scenario is out of government control, but fiscal revenue is also subject to aggressive commodity tax planning schemes. And unlike commodity price shocks, tax-based erosion caused by commodity tax planning schemes is under the government control by imposing transfer pricing rules on commodity transactions. So let's check on a well-known commodity tax planning scheme. For instance, let's suppose an Argentinian company exports soybean to a related party domiciled in, let's say, France. And soybean market price in France is $500 per ton. But in order to save some dollars in taxes, the Argentinian company decides to sell through a trader domiciled in Panama, which is considered a tax haven for some countries, even as of today. So The Argentinian company sells the soybean to the trader in Panama, invoicing $300 per ton, but the soybean is exported to France, not to Panama. And later on, the company in Panama invoices $500 per ton to the French company. So in this commodity tax planning scheme, the Argentinian company reduces its tax base in $200 per ton, and those profits are shifted to Panama, where trading companies have special tax regimes. So in the end, the economic group optimizes its tax expenses as a whole. It's important to note that multinationals managed to do this tax planning scheme while complying with transfer pricing rules in force at that time, which was usually accomplished by rejecting the comparable uncontrolled price method and in turn selecting the TNMM, the transactional net margin method, which is a last resort method and usually one of the most subjective transfer pricing methods. Besides, the trader companies usually had no assets, no employees, no commercial or economic substance. They were mere paper companies. The Argentinian tax administration has identified this tax planning scheme long ago, and in order to put an end to this scheme, set up domestic transfer pricing rules for commodity transactions that became known as the Argentinian method or the sixth method. As you can see in this slide, these commodity rules were enforced in Argentina in 2003, and they were followed by Uruguay, Ecuador in 2008, Brazil, Costa Rica, Honduras, Bolivia, Guatemala, Dominican Republic, Peru, and lastly in Paraguay in 2021. So all of these countries implemented commodity rules in their regulations. These domestic rules on commodity transactions set up by tax administrations in all of these countries are applied to different types of commodities, usually on top export products of each country. For instance, oil, banana, and minerals in Ecuador, soybean in Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina, etc. Besides, all of these domestic rules have one thing in common. They urge the mandatory application of a COP methodology approximation by selecting a quoted price at the commodity shipping date, following tax administration's tailor-made instructions. So, by the way, our source here is the Inter-American Center of Tax Administrations. Now, let's talk about the OECD recommendations. As you know, in 2015, Action 10 of the BEPS Action Plan examined the transfer pricing aspects of cross-border commodity transactions between related parties and considered the experiences of countries that have introduced domestic rules aimed at pricing commodity transactions. The outcome of this work is an improved framework for the analysis of commodity transactions from a transfer pricing perspective, which should lead to greater consistency in the way that tax administrations and taxpayers determine the arm's length price for commodity transactions. and should ensure that pricing reflects value creation. This new guidance on commodity transactions is included in the 2017 version of the OECD TP guidelines and the most recent 2022 version. Now, let's talk about, well, let's make a comparison between domestic rules versus OECD proposed methodology in the BEPS project. So let's talk about first of the methodology. The OECD agrees the CAP method is appropriate for establishing the arm's length price for the transfer of commodities between related parties. But the OECD establishes that CAP should be applied only in commodities for which a quoted price is used as a reference by independent parties in the industry. Whereas the sixth method is generally applied in commodities where a quoted price is not used to set prices in uncontrolled transactions. About comparables, the OECD agrees to use quoted prices as comparables, which refer to prices set out in a commodity exchange market. But according to the OECD, a quoted price also includes prices obtained from reporting or statistical agencies, or from governmental price-setting agencies, where such prices are used as a reference by independent parties. The pricing date. The sixth method usually sets the shipment date for CAP application, but the OECD suggests that tax administrations shall consider the pricing date agreed by the related parties whenever possible, and only use shipment dates as last resource when taxpayers cannot provide sufficient evidence on the pricing date agreed. So now let's talk about comparability adjustments. Comparability adjustments in the sixth method are way limited. Whereas the OECD establishes that sufficient comparability adjustments shall be made to ensure that the economically relevant characteristics of the transactions are comparable. For instance, the physical features and quality of the commodity, the contractual terms of the controlled transactions, such as volumes traded, periods of the arrangements, the timing and terms of delivery, transportation, insurance, and foreign currency terms. Even contributions made in the form of functions performed, assets used, and risks assumed by other entities in the supply chain should be adjusted. So let's talk about now my conclusions and recommendations. Well, the OECD rejects the main rules set out in the sixth method by considering those rules to be used as a last resource. It is common between independent parties for the price to be agreed using future prices. Therefore, the pricing date should not be spot or the shipment date. The sixth method may affect taxpayers' taxable capacity by taxing a non-existent income. And finally, we encourage the adoption of new OECD guidelines on commodity transactions and the application of sixth method rules as last resource only. So thank you all for joining. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. I hope to see you all soon. Thank you very much and have a good day. Bye.